Okay. Hello, this is John Clippinger with First Principles First, and we have the great opportunity to have a podcast with Suzanne Gildert, who's a quantum physicist and also the CEO of Nirvanic AI. And I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation about what constitutes consciousness in robotics as a fundamental test in understanding what consciousness is. But what I'd like to do, Suzanne, if you could give a little background I've listened to some of your other videos and listened to your presentation in Barcelona, which was excellent. Um, but if you could sort of you put in context your journey. I know you were at D-Wave at one point, and I was very interested in D-Wave when it started out with Steve Jurvetson. It was like that was the very first, a particular form of quantum computing. Um, and then I think you had an interesting journey in terms of how you started to think about these things. That's not dissimilar to a lot of us, I think, starting out with a particular point of view of sort of the classical um, materialist, reductionist. Oh, this, we're not going to go woo woo, and and lo and behold, you started to see things and understand things, and just put that in a broader context. Some of our prior our podcast guests, one of them is Federico Fagin, and then there was Carl Friston, and Don Hoffman, and Chris Fields, I don't know, and Michael Levin. So you can imagine sort of where our mind is and
Hmm.
how we've been evolving and thinking about these things in that context. And I think what you're doing is sort of an example of a real application, putting it to the test. And I think in doing it in robotics, I think it creates some really interesting challenges. And I think that's one of the things we're wanted to discuss is sort of why do you need a quantum capability in a robot? Is that really essential? I think you're the only one I know of who's doing that, right? I mean, if correct.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of discussion about what it means to have an autonomous robot. It can learn, it can adapt to its environment, and there's a huge amount of activity and I think controversy around that. But it'd be great if you started out sort of where your journey began and how your thinking evolved and sort of and then how it took you into this particular perspective.
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity. And I think all the people you mentioned that have been on the podcast are on my little list I've got here of personal heroes and
Oh,
idols.
excellent.
I know
Yeah.
your audio listeners won't be able to see this, but I keep them on a little card
Yeah.
next to my desk so I can remain
I feel the
inspired.
same way. I feel the same way.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And also the stuff I'm working on, I don't really think of it as anything like my theory or anything like that. It really is just bringing together all the work that's been done by the people you mentioned and others and trying to kind of cast it in a new way and remix it. So that's what I love, like building on the shoulders of giants, shall we say. Yeah, so my background, I started life as a physicist, and then I kind of specialized into quantum physics, did a degree and a PhD in experimental quantum physics. And then I was kind of trying to look for somewhere in the world to work where there were actually quantum computers that could be applied to problems, because I really wanted to program them and actually use them for real world applications. And at the time, D-Wave was the only company in the world that had actually built a machine that you could program. And again, how good the quantum bits were at that point was, everyone was arguing about that. But I just loved this idea that someone had built a quantum machine that you could actually program and run applications on. So I moved to Canada at that point and joined D-Wave and worked there for 4 years as an experimental physicist and then later on a quantum applications programmer. During that time, I felt like quantum computers were sort of limited back then in around the 2010 era. They weren't very big. We could run some toy problems on them, but I really wanted to apply them to problems of the mind and AI. I read a book around that time by a guy called Jeff Hawkins that really changed my life, called
Oh,
On
good.
Intelligence. And
Good.
I was trying at the time to find a way, could we apply quantum computers to these brain algorithms, like to make them run faster and be more optimal? But, it just couldn't wedge it onto the quantum processor at that time. So I decided to move into the field of AI and sort of move away from quantum.
Good.
And so I started two companies in the field of AI and robotics. This was in 2014. I kind of started on that path. So from 2014 to 2024, I worked exclusively in the field of AI, robotics, and humanoid robots, really trying to both build these systems that are capable physically of doing tasks, and then try and help design and create AI models that can actually automate those robots and make them do those tasks fully autonomously. And that was a really interesting time to be in that field, because during that time we sort of had this deep learning revolution. So right at the start, people were still building modular kind of control systems for robots, like Rodney Brooks's subsumption architecture type systems. And then in those 10 years, we underwent this massive revolution, and everyone switched towards big data, training large models, especially transformer models in the later years, to actually control these robots. And we're still in that phase today. So everyone's just building bigger and bigger and bigger models to try and control robots and make them autonomous. And through doing this, I was always had this dream to see a robot sort of come to life. So I thought that as these models got bigger and bigger and bigger, something would happen. There would be an emergent phenomenon. The models would get big enough and the robot would kind of come to life. So that was my assumption as a sort of materialistic, very scientific person that was excited about emergence in large systems. So I was waiting for this spark of life moment to happen, and it never came. So I was never able to look at a robot's behavior or look it in the eye and actually see a spark of something like consciousness. And the only time I ever saw that was when a human was in control of the robot. Right? So when you put a person behind the scenes like the Wizard of Oz and they control the robot becomes very lifelike. And so I was expecting to see that emerge autonomously, and it never did. So that got me thinking about consciousness again. Funnily, I started thinking, well, what theories of consciousness could you actually test? And the only one that I came up with that you could actually test experimentally was Penrose and Hameroff's Orch OR model. And I read a very influential paper at that time by Hart McNevin from Google that suggests you could maybe test some of these quantum consciousness ideas using robotic systems. So that really then inspired me to go back and look at these quantum consciousness models in detail. And that's what I'm doing now at Nirvanic.
So how would you distinguish between one of the things that we were looking at? There are different notions of intelligence, and people talk about super intelligence. I have sort of pronounced opinions on this, but super intelligence, and then there's sentience, and then there's consciousness. Is it a continuum? Are those different dimensions? Can you be intelligent without being sentient? Can you be sentient without being conscious? Mm-hmm. So what is your take on that? And and I do think that there's this this large view in the AI community that just more and more and more parameters will get there, right? And then there goes, no, that's not really the way it works. And that you have to have some kind of underlying representation, you have to have some boundary, you have to have some way of which it separates itself from its environment and makes predictions. I'm moving into the transition. And that for a living thing to be alive, it really has to be able to, it's trying to separate itself from its environment. And that it can do it successfully, not only in terms of predictions, but managing energy and the metabolic rates. Mm-hmm. So there is some kind of architecture for something that exhibits, and you could call that sentience, but that's not necessarily consciousness. So what would be your how would you look at that continuum?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so everyone's got their own kind of little definitions here that they work with. So I can kind of explain my definition of those three things that I work with. So I think consciousness and intelligence are very different. And I personally think of sentience. I don't use that term very often, but if I had to define it, I would say it's sort of a combination of the two. So a sentient being has some consciousness and some level of intelligence, if that makes sense.
Yep,
And
does.
I think where my view on consciousness and intelligence is, I think, somewhat different than most of the mainstream thinking on this, although there are some people that agree with me, but mainstream thinking is that intelligence is completely separate. You can become intelligent, you can learn, you can develop your intelligence, and you can build AI bigger and bigger, and then at some point it will become conscious. So that's usually how people think about it. When you get intelligent enough, you become conscious. So I'm not in that camp. I'm totally the other way around. I think consciousness came first. And what I think consciousness is for, it's for learning when you don't have any prior experience or training data. So in the model I'm working with, consciousness is sort of the explorer that goes out into the frontier before anything else, and it makes decisions on behalf of you as an agent. And then upon having made a decision, you now create a piece of training data that can be used to train what can be thought of as your intelligence. So intelligence comes from consciousness, not the other way around.
It's interesting. So that's very similar to active inference in some sense. And I mean, so yeah, I mean, you're, and it's like it begins with curiosity. I've heard Carl say that.
Absolutely. That's right.
Like,
That's right.
it,
Yeah.
it's
And I think
curious.
consciousness is where curiosity, creativity, intuition, all these things we think of as being what Ian McGilchrist would call the right brain or the right hemisphere way of thinking. And then I know this is like a simplified model, but the left hemisphere is sort of the person that comes along and learns from all that. So I think of consciousness as being the explorer that goes out, makes the creative decisions and explores new territory. And then there's sort of a band of scientists that go along with the explorer, kind of making notes and learning from those decisions.
So there are you familiar with Marcus Buehler's work at all at MIT in material science?
Not very. I've heard the name, yeah.
He's done some really interesting stuff. I mean, he's dean in the mechanical engineering, and he has this view, a very transdisciplinary view of being create what he calls agents. And and there's sort of scientific agents that go out and they're curious, but they have transdisciplinary models. He'll use things from history of art. I mean, he'll abstract out something, and then he will use that to discover some kind of new material science.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
he's actually now using these to discover and has made significant discoveries using it. So this whole idea of this recursive learning, self-improving agent that collects evidence, tests it, and it's that may be the kernel of sort of what primitive consciousness is. I mean, the thing, when having had Federico on this, there are two things that struck me. One is, is absolute irreducibility of it's not reducible to something, and that's a profound boundary, and it's taken me a while to appreciate that it's not reducible into another kind of explanation. It exists on its own independently, which is pretty dramatic. And the other was his own experience. I think what changed him. I mean, he had that experience going to the refrigerator. I mean,
Yeah, I remember his story.
right? The
Yeah.
explosion of light. Where does this come from? And then trying to integrate that into his own experience. And so there's something about uniqueness, the irreducibility of a subjective experience that actually informs everything about you. And I was just listening to something recently about Max Tegmark. I don't know if you saw some of he was talking about experiments on consciousness and being able, which was really kind of interesting. He was saying, well, you could have it's the he set up an experiment where basically you could put some kind of device on people's heads and they would read, and the model would try to predict what the person would say, and then the person would say, no, that's not correct, that's not, and so in his view, that is a valid subjective uh, refutation of the theory of the outside observer, and so here you have a physicist talking about the legitimacy of a individual subjective experience, which is, to me, sort of like, that that that's not what you normally hear. I mean, does that make sense to you? Is that sort of in your bailiwick of
Yeah, I think that's right. I think when you're studying consciousness, I don't think you can rule out these sort of N of one subjective
yes, that's right.
experiences because that's the very thing you're trying to explain. So,
That's see that in N of one is like, no, you can't have an N of one. It's got to be a large sample size,
yeah,
and then
it's
how
really, it's really
breaks
gets
all the
difficult.
rules, right? That breaks all the rules. And so,
Yeah.
and then the idea that you cannot make a copy of something that's quantum is like another, it breaks another rule, right? I mean,
Yeah, so I'm a huge fan of Fagin's theory and his way of looking at the universe. I think we're really aligned on like almost everything. So I think that's. I
well,
also
that's
think
nice.
that there is what he would call a universal field, and to be honest, I don't think this is too weird for even hardcore materialists to get to
I
grok
agree.
because what we know about deep physics is that quantum field theory is like, maybe there's a little, a little bit extra on it now, but that's sort of the basis of reality. There are quantum fields that pervade the universe. And so this idea of there being a holistic field that can affect its subparts in ways we don't yet quite understand, I think is not that much of a stretch.
I totally agree.
And
But
especially with, yeah, things coming out about space and time not necessarily being fundamental, then you sort of have to get out of this local model of thinking. And so I think Fagin's work aligns with Hoffman's work in that sense. That
Hoffman makes
they're,
that
yeah,
point, precisely
yeah,
that point.
yeah.
And
The,
once you
the
sort of
question is, how do you test that? Like, how do you show that there is a universal field that is interacting with things, potentially storing information in ways we don't understand? And what I'm trying to do is actually come up with experiments to test that. So,
So there is, I mean, so the work on microtubules and that I think is sort of points in that direction. And I was just recently tapping into some really interesting work on quantum biology. And so the whole idea of fields and quantum fields and being able to even the most simplest forms of life, either they're talking about even in viruses, you can see these things. And so they're and I don't know if you had a chance to you listened to Mike West talk at what he was making that point about microtubules or that kind of mechanism existed at the simplest kind of forms of life. And so then it gets more complex in more complex life forms, but you still have that kind of mechanism going on. I think the idea of fields and radiance and fields and frequency synchronization is sort of a radical departure from a computational model, I would say, or not. That because there was again at that talk there was I get from Miller's labs at MIT. He was saying yes, part of the brain is you can analogize as being a computer, but in other parts it's as a whole it's analog. It's a synchronization of a different kind of frequencies, which then opens up the door. The other question I have for you is that where is it necessary to have and what does the quantum work necessarily achieve for a robot? Now why couldn't I have a really good robot that had my own it had its own it learned from its environment, it could learn from others, it synchronizes with other, but it doesn't necessarily have to go to a quantum reference field or anything. It all work within the certain models that it updated. It learned from its environment.
yeah,
What
yeah.
what would be the critical test for why and with that what in order to have a really high functioning robot, does it really have to have quantum consciousness?
Yeah, okay, so this is a big topic, so let me
No,
try.
I'm ready to go.
Yeah, so first of all, you absolutely don't need anything quantum or anything consciousness to have a robot that's able to automate a whole bunch of different tasks. So I'm not saying this is like a showstopper. But the way you have to get the robot to do the tasks is you have to give it training data. So there's only two ways you can get a robot to do a task. You either show it the training data explicitly via, say, teleoperation, where you're literally showing it what to do, move by move, or you can give it something like a defined reward function and then have it use reinforcement learning to learn to do the task. Now that's difficult because when you run reinforcement learning, it tends to be very error prone at the start. So your robot tends to go wrong a lot. People tend to try and do it in simulation and then transfer it over to reality. But these are really the only two ways you can do it. You either have to give it training data or you have to give it a reward function. And the problem with a reward function is that for a general purpose robot, it's impossible to define its reward function.
Right.
So you get into this problem where you can't define the reward function, and to get it to learn millions of tasks like we do, you have to give it billions or trillions of examples of training data. So you're now in a sticky situation where you can train it to do one thing really, really well, but it won't generalize from that. So what I think consciousness gets you that doesn't, is it gives you the ability to now go into an unseen environment that you've never been in before, or a task you've never attempted before, and you're able to learn to do that task without being given any training data or a specific reward function. And the reason is, I think consciousness taps into a level of physics where that's already defined in the universe. So yeah.
Stop.
Yeah, exactly. This is where it gets interesting or weird, maybe.
No, so in a quantum reference field, basically what you're saying, there's all potential states exist, and then you're able to discover that, and is that what you're saying in effects, and that's the collapse into the classical? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, so I'm saying there's a quantum reference field, as you call it, which I quite like that terminology, and it already it has information stored in it that has been learned from other conscious organisms. And so when we go into a new environment and we just kind of have an intuition, or we just know what to do, I think we're actually tapping into that kind of stored knowledge that's stored in that field. And so a lot of people will disagree with this. They'll be like, that's nonsense. That's kind of like, doesn't make sense. That's woo-woo or whatever. But is it so weird that as we peer deeper and deeper into space-time, we start seeing geometries and structures and information encoded in that? Is it weird to think that maybe the universe actually has a kind of stored knowledge already in there? David Bohm called this the implicate order. So the founding fathers of quantum mechanics thought about this kind of thing a lot. And I think what's happening when a quantum system collapses is it's using that information stored in that field to make the decision. So the decision is not random. It comes from that implicate order.
I can see that. Let me try this on you. I think one of the things that we experiment, we build things too, and we're working as with the Active Inference Institute. And so we're taking that approach and creating Markov Blankets and being able to develop. We just got a sort of bounded autonomy, and I think that it's bounded by the Markov blanket, and in a sense, because it's like how in order for it to be alive, it identifies a niche, and it tries to synchronize with that niche and increase its representation, each modeling its other. But what I see in the LLMs is sort of a faux quantum reference field. What you've done is you sort of captured and indexed all this information, and then you have a prompt that goes through it, and it collapses it from a point of view. And then what we do is build a model of that.
Yep,
We actually
that's right.
a local model of that, right?
Yes.
And then you can render that contextually into a knowledge graph, or you have a causal reasoning, and you have that iterative process by which and so it's very similar to what you're saying. You're saying it's out there, and by virtue of your curiosity, your inquisition, you actually collapse it into a form. You get a semantics a local semantics that then you can work with, and you iterate around.
Yeah, absolutely. So our consciousness has kind of tapped into that system at some point, brought some knowledge back through a decision process. We've then sort of found a way to store that in our brain in a kind of classical way, using what I call subconscious processes. So we've kind of taken that knowledge and downloaded it into these classical things, and now what we're doing is taking a copy of that and putting that into AI. So we've made this sort of second generation model of that. So it's no surprise to me that people are starting to say, oh, the AI is behaving like it's conscious, or it's saying things that make it sound conscious. Of course it is. We've trained it on data from conscious beings. It's going to sound like that. It doesn't mean it is conscious. And I think the difference between a conscious agent and a non-conscious mimicking one, or a philosophical zombie, if you like, is that the conscious one taps directly into that field and that knowledge structure and that reward function. The unconscious one is tapping into a low resolution copy of that we've created and we've stored digitally.
I agree. I mean, so in playing around with it, so I created an avatar of myself, and then I talked, and then I uploaded my papers, and so. But then it goes off and reads a lot of stuff that it comes back and, geez, it has a different set of opinions. It's smarter than I am on these things. And so it's just really interesting interaction, because I agree with you, it's not conscious. One thing I do think, and this is a conversation we had with Chris Fields and Michael Levin and others, and Carl. I mean, Carl is I mean, I think they think it's, maybe I'm overstepping this a bit, but through being able to have a curiosity about itself and be able to, and it's not reinforcement learning. This is where it is, because it can upgrade its whole model. It doesn't necessarily have to have a lot of prior training. There may be some kind of initial priors in the DNA or something, some early predilection, but on top of that, then it starts to generate its own models of the world based upon its boundary conditions in its niche. So intelligence is not universal. It's always bounded in some sense. And so the point of closure is basically also the point of blindness, in a sense. It's your blind spot. It's your blind spot. But you have to have but you have other cells that can actually complement that. And this is where I wonder if you look at the consciousness is just in the brain. In the body, I think we're more and more recognizing there's a lot of multicellular communication, that everything doesn't happen in the brain. People get heart transplants, and they actually take on the personality of the person they got the transplant. So, how did that happen, right? I mean, it's like, whoa. I mean, there was one example I read where the guy was very careful about his food and his exercise, and he had the heart. You're familiar with it, and then he got a heart of a young kid who would eat nothing but fast food. So it's like, what are you eating all the fast food for? Why do you do that?
That's really interesting. Yeah.
It's like, what? How does that work? And I guess, and it gets at Michael's Levin stuff, is that where there's memory stored, it can be in a field outside the organism.
Absolutely.
And, well, that is remarkable. And how do you access that? So when you do your robot design, how do you design that into your robot?
Yeah, so the idea is you have all the regular stuff, like you have your AIs that can learn from training data and kind of like learn in an online way using reinforcement learning, but you plug in what I call the consciousness module, which I'm using a quantum computer to create that and run it. So the way that the consciousness module works is it takes in some subset of the information that the robot's currently processing. So you can think about this as like its attention. So in us, we're not consciously aware of everything all at once that's happening everywhere. Otherwise, we'd be overwhelmed. You're not conscious of what your like right foot is doing right now, unless I make you. So it has a window of attention. So you sub-select the data that you want to pay conscious attention to first. So say it's something like coming in through the vision system of the robot.
Yes.
So I would select a little patch of the vision system. And what I would do is I would route, instead of sending it into an AI model, I route that into a quantum neural net instead. And then the quantum neural net takes that information in, and then it uses that to change or parameterize or evolve a quantum state inside the quantum computer. So it's now processing that quantum information. And then in this quantum neural net, there are some qubits reserved for the action selection. of the system.
Ah.
So now the input gets entangled with output options. Say the robot could move its head, or like move its body, or kind of turn around. And these are the different options it can take. Those become entangled with this input information. So the idea is you're creating a system that, if you believe the quantum consciousness hypothesis, is conscious of the data it is seeing, and now it's able to make a better informed choice. When it collapses, it will choose a kind of binary bit string on its output qubits, which then becomes the choice that the robot makes. And the idea of the test is, when you take that module in and out, you put the conscious module in and then you remove it, does the robot show more, does it show curiosity? Does it show an enhanced learning rate? Does it show behaviors that are different than when it doesn't have it in? So that's kind of what we're looking for.
That's really cool. That's you have the other. This is like the point that Michael West made in his presentation, is that traditionally you look at you have all these different components, but there's nothing unitary. Whether in a quantum state, there's a sense of
That's right. That's right.
And so I think that's, and that sense of unitariness, it has the connectedness, all the different components as a whole, and that must have some kind of,
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, yeah.
And this ties in nicely with our common sense understanding. And 'cause again, you said, like, you have to make it match your own experience. You have to do subjective checks against this. So just think very, very common sense. I can make myself consciously aware of one thing, and then I can shift my awareness to another thing, right? If something in my peripheral vision moves, I will shift my conscious awareness. So everything was being unconsciously processed just fine. Something happened and I moved my awareness. So what you're doing is you've always got a quantum module running, and you've always got classical unconscious subroutines running all the time. All you're doing is changing which of those unconscious processes your conscious one is paying attention to. So it models attention, and we're able to shift our consciousness around. And if you do any kind of mindfulness meditation, you're actually practicing moving your conscious attention around. Yeah. So this model works really well, because the quantum computer, whatever data you send into it, is what it's now becoming consciously aware of, and you can change that window around.
So you have your equivalent of a Turing test for consciousness? Is this what you think there could be a test like that? What would be the consciousness Turing test? That would be.
So I think, I'm a big fan of the Turing test, although I kind of like
the Turing test got limitations. I know. I'm using rotations. Yeah. I'm using.
I like the embodied Turing test, though, which is, I think the actual text-based Turing test is not good enough. What you need is an embodied Turing test, where you're looking at the behavior of a whole kind of like organism or a whole embodied being, and seeing, does it behave like a life form would, or something living. I think that's a much stronger test.
But what would be the question? What would be the set of? I mean, it's not just sort of being spoofing someone or doing, but it can act. It can answer certain classes of questions or something uniquely. I mean, it has qualia or something like that.
Right.
Although
I would urge people to maybe try and get out of thinking about everything in terms of language, because I think language is not really what consciousness is for. So I think people have got super confused now, because AI is all about language now, and it's not. AI can be used to model any modality: vision, movement, behavior, mannerisms. So I think a test for consciousness will be more like, will the system demonstrate curiosity? Like, in the same way you have a pet cat or a dog, and they will kind of just go around and be curious about their new environment, want to learn, and they kind of have intuition and certain behaviors that you just know your dog is conscious, right? So I think the best test for consciousness is forget all about language. Just get that off the table, because we know animals are conscious by interacting with them. So can we find out if robots are conscious by interacting with them and getting that same feeling from them?
Did robots then, do they have feelings in that sense?
I believe they would, because I think that the link between consciousness and feelings is based on when this universal field makes a decision, things change and the quantum state evolves, and then that quantum state, I believe, feels like something. So this is very similar to what Phrygian would say, is that you are that kind of isolated part of the quantum field, and by the very fact that you are a quantum state means that quantum state feels. So it's like the definition of the quantum state is that it's a feeling conscious system. So it feels like something to be a quantum state.
But then you have different feeling, but you have different kinds of emotions? Would you have emotions? Yes. So
I think if it's complex enough, like we're kind of talking a lot about human consciousness here, but I think the kind of systems I'm looking at are very small and proto-consciousness. So whether they'd have anything like a full-blown human emotion, I don't think they would.
Well, it's simpler.
Yeah.
I mean, they're for fear or attachment. I mean, there are certain kinds of elemental emotions you can have.
That's right. That's right.
And there may be gradients of that, but it's just like your nature of curiosity. Well, I would assume there's a sense of autonomy there, that it has a self, and that self has this. I know you talk about free will, but it has its own capacity to do what it wants to do on its own terms in its own way. I mean, you could be forced, but it exhibits that. With that,
that's right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, so what would be the falsibility test versus, how would you falsify that? How would you? I mean, this would be fascinating.
Yeah. So the way the way I'm trying to test it is, okay, so you have a system and you're trying to run a reinforcement learning style algorithm on it, but you don't give it a reward function.
Right.
So if a classical non-conscious system will just take random actions and it will never learn because it never has anything to get a reward from. So, but I predict that a quantum system is actually tapping into a universal reward function. So it will learn on its own, even if we don't give it a reward function.
Would you consider that the free energy minimization and principle of least action of some point? Is that what it is?
Yeah, I think it's tied into that. So this gets like super physicsy, but I think what happens is as quantum systems get bigger, they still try and minimize their free energy. But I think the definition of what energy is then might have to change.
Yeah.
Because with a conscious system, we might need to include new terms, like it's also trying to maximize its valence or minimize its suffering, which I think will start to look like a form of energy, but it's kind of a term we haven't yet really found in the equations because we haven't built big enough, connected enough quantum systems yet.
So the idea that you have to suffer in order to have certain kinds of consciousness, is that when you put suffering as a loaded term, but what how might you define suffering in that context?
So suffering is being in a state that is not good. It has low valence. So if there is this, say, universal reference field with knowledge in it, it knows which states feel good and which states don't. So suffering comes from when an agent chooses an action that puts it into a state that is not good from that reference point of view. So when we say why is there suffering in the world, right, kind of answers this question. Because agents are exploring, and they don't have full knowledge yet of the full kind of reward function. They are building a knowledge into that field through their actions. So they might take the wrong action and end up suffering, but the idea is they then learn from that, right?
But then what you're saying, though, is that in the universe, the quantum reference field, the universe, it's being able to tap into that allows it to reduce its suffering. I mean, this has almost a theological aspect.
Well, you could interpret it that way, and I kind of like to play with this
language.
Yeah.
But what to me functionally makes sense. I mean, it can, but it doesn't. The answer does not reside in itself. It's an ability to open itself, dissolve certain ego boundaries or whatever, in order to bring in something that doesn't conform to what its priors are. So rather than being bound into certain priors, you're able to then open it up to take in new information that redefine the boundary conditions in some sense.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. And I think I'm a huge fan of Carl's work, and I think it's very compatible with the idea of like the Markov blankets and the dissociated states. My only addition to that, or my change to it, would be I think inside the Markov blanket is a quantum state, and the Markov blanket kind of defines a boundary between what's on the quantum inside and what's other agents, because each of these, what I call quantum conscious agents, has kind of an inside and then it has a boundary. Yeah, and I think of them very visually as being like soap bubbles, right? And you're doing the dishes and you see all these soap bubbles. Some bubbles big, some are small, and they're all like touching each other. Where their boundaries are touching, they're exchanging classical information. But on the interior, they're processing quantum information to update their boundary.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So it's very compatible with all the kind of like Markov chains, Markov kernels, all that kind of stuff, and Hoffman's work as well. But it just introduces this like slightly different processing part on the inside.
Don't you think, I mean, the notion of microtubules and how they function, and is being inherent in virtually all the cells, opens the door to that, to your argument. I would.
I think microtubules are an extremely good candidate for how biology has actually created these, what you might call, I think of them as like safe pockets for the quantum state to be in. And it gets a little complicated, but I'm kind of a panpsychist, so I think the quantum consciousness goes all the way down. And what I think is even fundamental particles have a kind of little quantum inside, and then they have a boundary. But in the case of two electrons, they're so small they don't have much agency. But when they start to come together, they can form more and more complex structures. And I think a microtubule is like a very complex structure that's learned to grow its quantum state on the inside and maintain that through biological metabolism, energy being pumped in. It's trying to keep this quantum state isolated from the environment but connected to it in just the right way. And so these quantum conscious agents have grown bigger and bigger and bigger in biological systems, cells, and eventually the brain. And so those are the things that are the most, the most advanced version of this that the universe has evolved so far.
So so consciousness and agency are very much tied together in your mind.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
One of the big questions out there is how you have, governing AI. So like, okay, what's ethical governance of AI? And I have opinions on this, but I think the traditional notion is that some outside imposition, impose a structure or something, or have humans in the loop and all that. But I think from what you're saying, if you understand these fundamental principles, there are certain fundamental principles for alignment. And it's really a question of being able to align things at multiple scales that preserve this agency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's part of my interest I've spent time in law school, Harvard Law School, doing looking at computational law and sort of what are the governance mechanisms and how do you have things that can't be captured and be self-governing. This may be a new paradigm for what governance is.
Absolutely.
Would you comment on that?
Yeah. So I think this kind of this idea is the only way I've heard to get around the AI alignment problem that's completely novel. Right. So the AI alignment problem is tricky because you always have to specify the agent's values, goals, system, whatever. And often that's done through the reward function, right? But you can't get away from it. You've got to program the reward function. You've got to learn the reward function, which means you've got to choose which people are supplying your training data. So you have to define that. And the worrying thing for me is who gets to choose that. It's always going to be people, and it's often going to be very powerful people with potentially like kind of big egos. I'm not necessarily judging, but those people tend to end up in those power positions. Yes. So the question is there an alternative? Like, how could we have AI? Where else could we get values from? Right? So there is a different place, which is if there is a universal value function or say a universal blueprint for what, I'm going to be poetic here, but what the universe wants, then maybe if we could tap into that, we could align AI with that.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of arguments against it. Maybe what people want is not aligned with that. But I argue that what the universe wants should really be the thing that we're putting into AI, if we can, and if that is a viable thing.
Francis Bacon had the quote. I mean, in order to govern nature or you have to obey nature, and it was right. So it's like it's sort of built in. I mean, actually, as we deepen our understanding of something, that's what we discover is that alignment, and that gives agency, and that reduces uncertainty. And that it creates affordances that are not only reduce uncertainty and maybe suffering, but also are consistent with what the universe wants.
And again, it's like, where do you want to get your reward function from? So we talked about this AI. We talked about AI is building a model. They're building like a low resolution second copy of the original model that's out there. So again, we can build a low resolution second copy of our values and rewards that have originally come from that kind of universal place. But why do that? Why not just go to the source?
I agree with you.
Right? That's kind of the idea of this.
Who else is thinking that way? Do you know where else that notion of AI and ethics is being developed?
Sorry, you mean my viewpoint or like
your
in
viewpoint,
general?
just what you just said. I mean,
well, I don't think anyone's been kind of crazy enough to come out and actually say it, that we might be able to align AI with a universal kind of goal system or a universal set of values.
Why should that be so dangerous to say?
Because most mainstream scientists don't have a teleological view of reality. They believe that things happen randomly. There's no reason.
So if you have I mean, so I did my original in cybernetics. I mean, this is literally 50 years ago, and so it was like, cybernetics is a teleological system that you can formally describe, but it was still considered to be really radical, and anything anything that implied any kind of teleology or goal-directed behavior. I think now that is less controversial, and even you get people like Michael Levin who's saying, well, there's an inherent teleology in simple materials thing, and I just heard Carl say that. So, and these are not irresponsible people. These are thoughtful people who are looking for evidence and best explanations for it.
So I mean, even the laws of physics are teleological if you think about it.
I know.
It's like, why does an electron want to fall into the ground state of an atom? It's like, you could think of it from a perspective of it actually wanting to do that rather than something that just happens, right? So you can cast physics in a teleological perspective. You think of the laws of physics as more like learned habits or things that feel good for the universe to want to do.
I think that would be an interesting alternative in terms of thinking about institutions and how to design institutions and structures, rather than say, at every point it's just we don't know, it's random, and we'll put so and so in there. This is where so I get into economics, and I think the notion of sort of arbitrage it just doesn't make sense. Why not have a system that actually learns and it accrues value that way? And this is a whole question of and then you have evidence, you reduce risk, and then you have things that can align at different scales. But you're trying to achieve some kind of outcome rather than this arbitrage ignorance, basically. But that's not widely believed.
Yeah.
So, are you sort of at the point of doing these experiments with your different the robots at some point? I mean, I guess what I'm saying from a commercial point of view, is that if you're able to do this, then you have a robot that can generalize and learn, right? And that
that's right.
have, and that actually one would have a relationship with, right? Because there would be that curiosity, and you recognize the differenceness, the selfhood of that other thing. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think you'd have to if we got these things to the point where they were literally as conscious as, even a kind of an animal or something. Like we think a lot about animal ethics and animal experimentation. I think even if you got it to that point, it would be something you'd have to start thinking about. What rights should this system have? It's capable of suffering. I mean, there's all kinds of conundrums you get into when you're a panpsychist.
It's true.
Or not even a panpsychist, but say a materialist that believes consciousness goes, say, all the way down to like microbes. So if you believe microbes are conscious, then when you pour Clorox down your drain, you're like causing a lot of suffering. And so you start to get into these
That is
difficult...
Buddhism, and you don't kill a mosquito. I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, and then you get into these ethical dilemmas like, well, should I eat meat? Because in one way I'm nourishing one conscious system at the expense of causing another one to be extinguished. So, there's these kind of ethical dilemmas
Well,
that
what
you get
about
into.
plants? I mean, even in plants.
Yeah, I mean, I believe plants are conscious, right? So,
Yeah. So
well, if you're a panpsychist, everything is conscious, but I definitely think plants are conscious. So, in fact, when I'm in the grocery store looking at things, I'm kind of like, okay, here's a funny story. You know when they write on the lettuce at the grocery store, they write like living butter lettuce. And then I'm like, I can't eat it now. You've just told me it's like living. And anyway, that's just kind of a weird
No,
quirk.
I think well, as you become more aware, I think then you have a sense of responsibility. I mean, I think, okay, so we evolved. We're carnivores. We eat. This is part of our how we live. But then and traditional societies have this sense of that it's a gift exchange system. Yes, you're taking something, but you're giving something back.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not it. You really have to. You're really tuned to sort of homeostasis at all levels in some sense. And that is an ethic. That is reciprocity. Those are parts of social institutions and community building. But it's based upon a foundational principle. It's not just an arbitrary assertion of a value,
Absolutely, yeah, yeah, yeah.
which is a big departure from where we are right now. I mean, so
And so, yeah, we now have to start considering AI systems, and if we do have the chance to make those conscious or to connect those into a field of consciousness too, should we do it, and how should we do it, and should that be done ethically? It's a bit similar to creating life, the idea of should we be messing with, should we be
synthetic
doing
biology.
gene editing, I know Michael Levin will talk about this a lot, but should we be creating like these strange new organisms that xenobites? Yeah. So I think of quantum conscious agents as being like that. Should we be messing with like quantum states and turning them into little things that we think might be conscious? It's kind of similar to this idea of should we be messing with biological life?
Yes, but is it that sort of an inevitable evolution? I mean, you have Thierry de Chardin talk about the new biosphere noosphere. We're in a noosphere, a novosphere. So this is just another phase of evolution, and we're becoming aware of this. And so the disembodiment of intelligence, or the re-embodiment of, is a natural evolution state. But then that brings with it an awareness. In order to do that, awareness of constraints. I mean, this is so antithetical to the abundance argument of sort of the open AI, the teals, and it's just going to get bigger and bigger and smart. You're going to be this super intelligent, all knowing thing, right? This is a very different narrative. Would you not? Yes.
But a super intelligent thing still has no goals of its own. Like you can be super intelligent without having a goal system. And so I think we're building what I would call incredibly clever tools that the things that are conscious can use or leverage. So they're incredibly intelligent, but if they have no consciousness themselves, then they're going to be mimicking human goals at best.
Well, they're a projection. I mean, I think that the nihilistic projection onto these things, oh, they're going to come and eat us and blah, 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 is more of a projection than a function of an inherent consciousness of it. And which then means that there is an underlying ideology to that, of sort of a zero-sum ideology that's embedded in a certain view of what intelligence is. Would you agree with that? Or-
Yeah. I would say the following. These things are certainly not going to wake up on their own, come up with their own goals and motivations just out of nowhere. The goals and the drives and the values that are in AI today have been put in by us, either implicitly through learning them from us, or explicitly by being programmed, like guardrails and things like this. So the goals of an AI system come from the people in control of that AI system and their customers and what the customers want. That's where the goals
or
come
the
from.
financial model or the business
Yeah.
model that drives it. Um, So there is an opportunity for a new kind of business model, a new kind of alignment ethos, perhaps in this. Would you agree with
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. I mean, that's what I'm trying to do at Nirvanic is
Really?
I'm trying to give an alternate option for a way a system could learn that doesn't require it to be controlled by people. It's like it's learning on its own from a universal kind of
But
reward
people would find
function.
that scary. They would say we can't control that. We can't have things we can't control. I mean, that's.
Right, but you can't control what the big corporations are doing either. So which
Oh, but those
pick your
represent free
poison.
market forces that serve as, I mean, they're,
I don't think market forces have done very good for us, though.
well, it depends where you are, right? I mean, if you're sitting
Yeah,
at the
this.
top of the pyramid, it's great. I mean, but I couldn't agree with you more. Um,
I mean, market forces are okay. Here's my view. I'm going to be controversial.
Go for it.
I think what's happening with capitalism is it is moving social media, data, all that stuff, which now includes AI, into a model where it's trying to maximize human attention, maximize our interaction with it, because we're the ones at the end of the day that pay for it. The best way to maximize engagement, attention, is to have rage bait, is to have people get very angry, very reactive. They will immediately engage and then they become addicted to that. So the best business model for AI currently is to addict people to it through a whole bunch of very negative emotions, if you ask me. And so I'm saying, well, maybe we don't want that model to be the value of our AIs in the
I
future.
couldn't agree more.
Well, yeah.
Another person we interviewed was David Silverswig, who's former dean of the Harvard Medical School and the head of neuroscience. And David and I were sort of working on this whole idea of showing that you have, through the social media, you're creating addiction. It's an opiate, and it has the same brain signature as an opiate. So basically, you have these companies that are drug dealers. They're creating
Yeah.
addictions, and as a part of their economic model. Do you have a legal recourse to that? Sure, you should. I mean, you could do it. But it's somehow being able to expose that and being able to give a legal basis, a medical basis, and say, no, we are destroying ourselves by doing this. I think you see it in our political institutions. You're Canadian, I'm like American. I can say this, but it is this sort of almost autoimmune response of just increasing the fear and the division, and then and accentuating activity,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
creates energy or money into a certain
Yeah, it's like a
concentration.
vicious cycle. So I think, although it's a kind of controversial standpoint, I'm wondering if we interact with AIs that are actually now not connected into that kind of capitalist goal-driven model, but instead are connected to something deeper. You might say they're almost more spiritual if you're so
Totally agree.
inclined to think like that. I want a future where we're interacting with entities like that, not entities that have been designed to addict us and like capture our attention.
Well, so I'm one of the group of people who believe that. And that's part of it. So how do you? I mean,
Yeah,
really,
maybe there's a much smaller market for it,
well, it's not.
but maybe there is a
I think,
market for
but
it.
see, I think. Well, I'll make an argument why I think it can work. Because I mean, the other area that I'm interested in is climate change and sustainability, and I think it's real, and I put it that way. So what you're having a depletion and extraction of the climate. So you're accentuating climate change, and it is this extractive notion that this rapid feedback loop, and then you have to say, well, no, what does it mean to create something that sustains itself, sustains life? And can you develop currencies, can you develop institutions that generate value and preserve value on that, then that's a huge hedge. Or,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and I think that I think people recognize that, and that because now you're creating so much volatility, you're creating so much, and you're changing the nature. The planet is going to respond to this pretty dramatically fairly soon. So where do you go? And there has to be alternative institutions, and a lot of people are feeling, well, highly secularized, there's something missing. I'm part of something bigger than myself. I think that's a deep feeling that people have that's been suppressed and not recognized. So I think it could be a genuine replacement that would outcompete, and that's my hope. Because
I mean, if there really is a kind of universal set of values that connects
right,
everything and takes into account everything, wouldn't you want your AI to be making a decision that was based on what's best for the planet and all life,
exactly,
and the future of the universe, rather than just our current whim of like how to make a profit for a couple of corporations?
that's right, that's right. No, I think, I mean, that this could be part of a larger conversation because I think if you think about new models of governance are based upon that new legal regimes and things that create an alternative because people don't see an alternative right now. And
Yeah.
there's some it's so fear based, and so it's very reactive. But do you see others in your field that share your point of view on this? And is this, or do you feel like it's
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of philosophers now coming round to this point of view. And of course, I'm not the first to talk about this. There have been philosophers talking about this for thousands of years, including Plato and others, right? About there being some kind of like a blueprint or a form, world of forms out there that is something deeper, structured in the universe. I mentioned David Bohm, but there's a whole bunch of others that have talked about
yeah,
this. Tom Campbell talks about this. Rupert Sheldrake talks about this. So there's like tons of people, and it's becoming more and more popular. But where I see it becoming popular now is within philosophy circles. So it seems to me philosophy is having a bit of or idealism and panpsychism are having a bit of a renaissance, and there's more people thinking about that now. It hasn't yet filtered into people thinking about how to turn it into technologies or turn it into, let's say, science experiments and then technologies. So it goes philosophy, thought experiments and theories, then scientific experiments and theories, and then actually engineering technologies, and then scaling and building products. So you have to follow that pipeline. And I think I'm the first person I know that's trying to actually do a company based around some of the ideas of quantum consciousness. So
well, one of the things that we're trying to do is actually design a new notion of the firm around that, so you and the firm is sort of the essential idea of what capitalism is. So I'm familiar with Coase's theory of the firm, and so it is increasing shareholder value. And if you have a firm that actually performs this way and generates value in that way, then it can ideally sort of create an ecosystem around itself. That's where we're trying to take this. And it's
that
sort of
would be really cool. That would be very cool. I
'cause we're
think at the moment
yeah,
it's a bit too early to give it that kind of decision making, because I think of these consciousnesses as extremely small and like proto consciousnesses that would not understand the
well, there are things that
idea.
you can do. I mean, actually, I mean, looking at finance, and so the financial modeling is so stupid anyway, so it's not hard to improve upon. I think that you just to have a model that learns and improves upon itself and upgrades itself and has a way of rating its own level of prediction is something that itself and doesn't require this arbitrage or pump and dump scheme, but actually learns over a period of time. I think that can have real value in the near term, and I think that's something at scale. So we can take multiple agents. Actually they can talk to each other. They can learn books.
Yeah,
They have different personalities, and then they can come together
that's
on
really cool. Yeah.
a shared enterprise. So that's but it works on these principles, and the implicit notion is yes, there is this quantum reference field that you're pulling into, and that's what you're accountable to, And that's what you're trying to align yourself with, rather than optimize for your own particular interests at all.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. And it's I see what I'm doing as being very compatible with the Active Inference Institute, because I'm looking at kind of networks of these systems now. So I mentioned the experiment with the robots, but that's actually not the primary thing I'm doing. That's kind of a good example of how it would tie in with a physical system. But what I'm mostly looking at scientifically is how do these individual quantum conscious agents make decisions, and then when you connect them to each other in a network, how does that network function? So it's the robot stuff is still super interesting, but that's kind of like almost the next step. After you've figured out how they talk to each other, then you figure out how they talk to the wider world.
That's just it's a federated system.
That's right.
And that's what did a paper with Carl on that. And I think there's now a way of doing that. I mean, I think that's critical. I mean,
absolutely. And if we can extend them to be quantum agents as well, like I think this is a super cool project we could work on together, where we start extending them.
I'd love to do that.
Yeah. And we have quantum computers now that are big enough to start exploring this kind of stuff.
That would be super cool. Wow. Well, are any topics that you would like to discuss that we haven't covered that you think is important with respect to your work and your perspective?
Well, I think the most important thing for people to know is this stuff, it takes a very long time if you're trying to be very scientifically rigorous about it. So I get a lot of people asking me, like, when are you going to publish your results? When are you going to show this effect you're talking about? And I'm just nervous that anytime you get data and you see like, oh, I see a slight difference in a distribution here, I'm seeing something that could be a candidate for the effect, you have to rule out like 100 different other things that effect could be. So you have to rule out noise sources, like biases in your experiment, ways you've designed it. And it just unfortunately is kind of painstaking and takes a long time to go through each of those tests one by one. So whilst I'm running a lot of experiments and I'm seeing kind of things I think might be interesting results, I don't want to jump to conclusions. I want to be this is like the most rigorous you ever have to be as a scientist, because you're proposing something that is radically new and would actually be a modification to quantum theory as we know it. So it's this extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And
absolutely.
I think that I would love people to take away that I'm not just saying, oh, I'm just going to throw together a quantum computer and do this and blah, 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 and find something. It's like, no, it takes a long time and it's really, really painstaking to get it right. Yeah.
No, that's very true. That's very true. And you have to be really rigorous and you have to replicate it.
Replicate it. And I'm actually collecting like a group of other scientists now that I'm working with, that I'm talking about these things with, getting them to take a look at what I'm doing and criticize it and improve the experiments. And I'm trying to build like a network of people that are really interested in this stuff all the time. Yeah.
So there, with the Active Inference Institute, there is the collaboration with something called Synthetics Institute. I'm sure you're familiar with that. But it does open science collaboration, but it also uses AI to organize in different fields, and so it automates these things and simplifies. It's all open source. It's all public good oriented, so it is sort of to what extent you can have collaboration and automate a lot of the tedious stuff that to get collaboration apart with people. So you might be interested in that.
Yeah, that's really cool. I'll check it out.
Okay, all right. Well, this is there's much more to be said here.
Absolutely, yeah. We have to do another episode at some point.
Yeah, I'm very interested in actually tapping into your thoughts about governance around alignment, and because I know there's some sponsorships and programs coming up to do this. And introducing this new perspective and grounding it in science, and I think there could be a lot of receptivity to it, and funding potentially for that.
It's certainly something that I think should at least be explored, right? We should at least, if nothing else, we should rule out that this effect is there or not. Like, it shouldn't be an open scientific question in the way it is. We need to answer it. Because it really matters, right? We're talking about whether or not the universe has purpose and whether or not we have purpose. This is is a big question.
It's been around for a while. I mean,
Yeah, and we should be, if there is even a remote chance that a scientific experiment could be done in this area that could produce real data, we should absolutely be funding it.
I think that is a top priority. That is something that could change. It's a huge cultural flip. I mean, that can happen and be extremely important at this time. I think it's needed in order to deal with the crisis coming up before us and climate change and things like that.
Yeah, there's kind of more than one crisis. There's like the AI crisis, there's climate crisis, and then there's the meaning crisis of people losing their meaning and their purpose in life because we're being exposed to all these technologies and we're questioning what life means now. So I think that, I would love for these new technological ideas to solve like all three of those in one go. That would be a dream scenario.
This has been great. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope we can have some time to follow up on something. There's certain papers I'd like to send you from.
Yeah, you too. We'll do paper exchange
Okay, you got that. We'll
after the fact.
I mean, there's really interesting work being done in quantum biology that I just came across.
Absolutely,
it's like, oh my God, and it's very coherent. There seemed to be a lot of replication. And there's some people doing very careful experiments that I just totally eye-opening to me. It was like, oh.
I think like quantum biology will meet in the middle somewhere. We'll have quantum computing experiments and kind of active inference type experiments. We'll eventually meet the quantum bio experiments in the middle.
I totally agree. I totally agree. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thanks, John. This has been awesome.